Welcome back, everyone. This is Zach Edwards with another episode of the Adventure Box Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. This is all brought to you by the game Historical Conquest. It's a game where you can have fun just by playing and learning history at the same time. So, playing and learning history. How the heck? Yeah, you got to check it out. Go to www.historicalconquest.com. It's that easy. It's just the name of the game. Okay, literally. Okay, so here we go. We're going to be talking about something that's quite big. I mean, this is like huge. This is a lot of time that we're going to be covering in just this 1 week. And it's only 2 days of podcasts, Monday and Wednesday. So Monday, we're going to be talking about the indigenous people or the natives that lived in the Americas, North America, before Columbus. Then we're going to go over to talking about the relocation of them after Columbus, before the United States. So everything today is prior to the United States forming. Now, at the same time, we're going to be talking about on Wednesday everything afterwards. Everything from the original colonies and how they dealt with, not just the colonies, when they became states, how they dealt with the Native Americans. Because at that point, people were calling them Native Americans. Actually, they were calling them Indians. It was later on that they would call them Native Americans, but they were basically Native and Americans. The land was America, and they were natives. They were not called Indigenous Americans. They were called Native Americans. And we even have the Indian Removal Act. You know, that's an actually act. It's not a Native American or Indigenous People Removal Act. No, Indian Removal Act. So we did call them, as the United States, we did call them Indian for a long time. Then they became Native American because they assimilated into our culture and their culture became our culture and our culture became their culture. It was a mix. There's a lot of things that we learned from the Native Americans. We're actually going to go over some of my heritage, which is actually the Cherokee. But we're going to be doing a lot of that later on when we go into the Trail of Tears. Because there's a lot more about the Trail of Tears than most of you have ever heard about, especially if you're in public schools. Actually, if you're in homeschooling too, or in private schools, there's not many people that would actually talk about this side of that whole story. But we're going to talk about it because we talk about everything. We do not leave anything out because, well, again, we can't talk about everything. But this is something that's really important to understand as an American, as someone that's looking at the Trail of Tears and things like that. So we're going to go over all this. Now again, Trail of Tears, later on when we talk about Andrew Jackson, who, funny enough, is also my relative. So I've got Andrew Jackson, and I've got the Cherokee Nation on my side. That's quite an interesting mix. But we're going to get into that later on. Right now, let's go prior to Columbus, prior European interaction. Now, European interaction, not counting the Vikings. If you want to hear about all things, like everything, the big picture during ancient America, go back to our textbook of ancient America or our first weeks when we talked about first weeks of the Adventure Box podcast, when we talked about the Native Americans. That's going to teach you everything you need to know about the movement over the Bering Straits, any other types of exploration that the people came over to the Americas. It wasn't just through the Bering Straits. There's actually other ways that believed they came through. So we cover all that in the first weeks of the Adventure Box podcast. This time, we're just going to focus on North America, and we're just going to focus on basically where the United States would become. Okay, so all that being said, let's go forward. Okay, so let me tell you about one thing before we go too much forward. Before Europeans arrived, North America was home to millions of indigenous people throughout the whole nation, from Canada all the way down to Mexico. That's all considered North America. Even though you'd think Mexico is more Central America, between all that there was millions. Now, cut off Mexico, and there were still millions between the United States and Canada, where they would become. So, just putting that out there. So this means that there was a huge diversity when it comes to cultures. Every one of their societies, every one of their civilizations, every one of their groups or tribes or anything, they had a diverse culture. and also a different language. Now, there was actually some speaking between them, but most of the time they had their very unique language. And they thrived through this. It was because of these civilizations, or in these civilizations, they had their own government, trade networks between them and other tribes, and also spiritual traditions. There's a lot of different diversity. Again, a lot of this is going to be in the first few weeks of the Adventure Box podcast. But going forward, when the settlers came, when Europe came, they brought a lot of other things, including disease, conflict, and forced displacement, which shaped the continent. But also, they brought new trade with the Native Americans. They brought new culture. They brought writing. They brought a lot of different things. So it's not all bad things that the Europeans brought on the indigenous. But again, we'll go over all of that. So let's start off with pre-Columbus. Okay, 1492, he came over the ocean, over the Atlantic Ocean, came to not the North America area per se, the Caribbean. He actually never stepped foot on the mainland of North America. He was always in the Caribbean. Actually, I think he had a spurt near the end of his life of South America. But he actually thought the whole time, until his dying day, he swore that was Asia. So he didn't actually know, but he did get to meet with a lot of different indigenous people. Now, I'm not going to go through everything that we went through back in the first few weeks of the Adventure Box podcast. You can do that. It's quite fascinating. It is not what you are being taught in the public schools, or it's not what you're being taught in media. Columbus was not the killer, destroyer of all nations type of thing. No, not at all. For one thing, think of it this way. Why did he come to that area? Oh, he came to trade. He wanted spices that were in that area because he wanted to get to India, Asia. He was not about conquering new lands. To them, Asia had already been conquered, basically. So when he came in, it was actually after he was imprisoned that new governors came in and really started to enslave the people, the indigenous. Now you can go back to his journals and read it. Just one thing you need to know about his journals, they were not written by him. The first two journals, his journals that he wrote, magically disappeared. I do not know how, but they're gone. No one knows where they are. But we do have copies of them written by one of the, used to be conquistador, used to be a encomiendo conquistador, someone that had taken over land and enslaved people, and then later he changed his ways and started fighting against enslaving the indigenous people. He's the one that rewrote Columbus's journals. Huh. Interesting. So he might have had a bias while writing those things. So how do we actually know what happened with Columbus? Because we have journals of other people, including the doctor that went with him on the second voyage and watched him go after the Carib tribe for enslaving the indigenous that he actually came to. So he basically became friends with the native tribe that he met first off. The Carib tribe were known to be possibly cannibals, and they took the women and children and some of the others and brought them over to their islands. And when the doctor arrived with Columbus for the first time they're seeing it, Columbus's men, the conquistadors, took over the island, enslaved some of the Carib tribe, freed the women and children. The women had been impregnated by the Caribs, as that is their culture, that is their way of bringing together the islands and having more control over the islands. And they found bones of people that might have actually been eaten. So, is it actually true that they were cannibals? Not quite sure. But okay, that is Caribbean. And I'm going off on a tangent. Sorry about that. Let's go back up to North America. So, Columbus never actually made it to North America. The first time that we had a lot of people coming up and starting to settle the New York area, the Carolinas, Virginia. Then they went up to Plymouth in Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth. Pennsylvania. Sorry, not Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. Okay, so let's talk about some of the indigenous people that were there at the time. So the eastern woodlands, mainly the Northeast and Great Lakes, these were known as the Iroquois land. Now, it was not just Iroquois, it was the Iroquois Confederation. Now, what was a confederation? A confederation, if you've been listening to podcasts, you might have heard this before a few times. Confederation is when you have a group of different groups come together. I say a group of different groups, it's because they weren't actually just one group. You had all these different groups that came together in times of war. So you had the Iroquois who wanted to take over a nation. Well, you had a tribe. This tribe had a confederacy of their own. And all of a sudden, there was a larger battle. Normally, if the Iroquois went to another confederacy, that confederacy would come together and fight the Iroquois. But if someone attacked the Iroquois Confederation would come together and fight that group. So there's the Iroquois, there's the Algonquin, and there is the Powhatan, people. They lived in longhouses, wigwams, practiced agriculture such as like corn and beans and squash. So this confederation, or these different tribes in the confederation, came together and created a pretty sophisticated democratic system. It was one of the first ones in the world, give or take, but it's one of the most sophisticated ones in the world at the time. Then you had the Southeast tribes on the East Coast. You had the Cherokee, you had the Creek, you had the Chickasaw, and you had the Seminole. Now, they developed chiefdoms. They had one person that was the chief over the whole group, the whole tribe. And so they had large villages. With larger villages, you needed to have someone that was in charge, someone that would take control if needed. Not could take control, but take responsibility. People would take leadership from them. They were also known as the mound builders. So you get these large mounds in the ground, and most people thought, oh, they're just naturally there. Well, no, actually they weren't. After actually some of them being excavated, some of them being x-rayed, they found bones, they found other artifacts in them. So this was the tribe that did that. Okay. They also believed in agriculture as well. And look at that. They grew corn, beans, just like the northern tribes, but also tobacco. And the big one is fish. They wanted to go after the fish on the East Coast and also down in the Gulf as well. The next group you have is the Plains Nation. Now, this is the Lakota, the Comanche, and the Cheyenne. Now, these were a very different tribe. They were not living off of agriculture as much. They were living off of, and they were semi-nomadic, but they were hunting bison. Now, remember, not buffalo. There's no buffalo in the United States. That is down in Africa. We have bison. When the Europeans came over, they got that mixed up. They had seen buffalo. They had not seen bison. This is bison. And they adapted to horses that were basically introduced by the Spanish. So this was a big thing for them, was horses and hunting bison, which was a lot easier when you had horses to hunt bison. Okay, now the Southwest. So we have the Northeast. We have the Southeast. We have the Plains. Now we're going into the Southwest, California area, Arizona, Nevada, those. Now these built adobe. Now adobe villages is basically a mud kind of, not concrete, but a mud substance to form full-on houses. They didn't use hides as much. They didn't use trees and other materials because they really didn't have it. Again, it's the Southwest. This is the Pueblo, the Apache, and the Navajo. They also, here's a great one, there's a place called Mesa Verde. I went there 4 or 5 years ago. And this is the cliff dwellers. People actually dug into the cliffs or found basically shaded areas near caves. They're not exactly caves, but they're indented areas into the mountainside, and they would build their houses there with stone, with mud, with everything. So this was great. This is the, again, Southwest group. There's the Pacific North. Now, I love this group because I lived in Alaska for a long period of my life. Let's see, I was born there, lived there through my high school years, came back for, I think, 5 to 6 years during the 2008 recession. Now, the people there are very friendly to others, not as friendly between themselves sometimes. There was a lot of disputes, at least when I was there. So let me go into it. This is the Tlingit, which is near like the panhandle of Alaska. Tlingit were, well, they're the ones that made totems. Tlingit and Haida. They made totem poles and wooden plank houses. Actually, there's also the Chinook. Chinook was also a tribe there. Interesting. Whenever I think of Chinook, I think of the Chinook salmon. But that's actually what was their culture of, that was their food source. It was mostly salmon, whales, there were some seals. There was a little bit of agriculture, but mostly that, and they would store it. They would cure it. You know, this is where you see the fish hanging over a fire and just sitting there for days. They were smoking the salmon. They were curing it, and they were getting it ready to be stored for winter. Another thing to know is their houses were made out of wood planks. They had a lot of greenery. If you go up to Alaska, you'll see all these huge trees. Well, they used that to their advantage, and they were able to cut those into pieces and make them available for their housing. Okay, next thing to know about. So that's the Pacific Northwest. Now, the Great Basin. This is California and a little bit going east from there. California, Oregon. Oregon is mixed between the Northwest and the Great Basin, but it's California, Oregon, and Idaho, a little bit I think into Wyoming, and down to Utah. That was this area. This was mostly Shoshone. This is the Paiute and the Chumash. Now these ones, they lived in small hunting gathering bands, groups. They had larger groups, but they mostly stayed in these places that they could be nomadic, could move around and be able to hunt their herds as the herds moved. Now, interesting to know, do you remember a woman? Her name was Sacagawea. Sacagawea went with Lewis and Clark on their voyage during the Louisiana Purchase. Now, this is well before her, but the Shoshone, and other tribes were constantly in battle, and all of them were. They were all fighting over larger herding grounds. They were all fighting over places to settle as they all expanded. When their tribes got bigger, they needed more land. So they were constantly fighting with each other. Now, Sacagawea was actually kidnapped from the Shoshone and had been brought over to another group to make them her part of their tribe. This was happening all the time. It was not a one-time thing. There was slavery in the Native Americans before Africans came over. They enslaved people from other tribes, prisoners of war, battles that had come in, and other things. And they also bought slaves as well. Now, these were not outside the area. These were more of between tribes. They also believed, or they had skills in things like basket weaving. And actually, they had a shell-based currency as well. In California, they were actually trading shells for other products. And those shells would be traded for something else. But they were basically their currency. Now, let's go into the trade. We're talking about the trade. The indigenous people had extensive trade networks. They were a lot more sophisticated than a lot of people want to give them credit for. They had very sophisticated trades, and they weren't the ones that were actually looking for these huge trades. where they were getting so much out of it. Like the Europeans, they came over, they wanted gold, silver, those type of things, and they traded for beads. And that was a fair trade to the Native Americans because they wanted glass beads, which were made by the Europeans. They didn't know how to do it. They saw those and, ooh, we want those, and they traded for it. They traded things that they had plenty of. Now, the Mississippian cultures, they traded copper, shells, and textiles, clothing, hides, those type of things. And they traveled far distances with that. Now, the other tribes, I'm not going to go into all of them because I know I'm running out of time already. 20 minutes right now. I got like 30 minutes I want to do. Okay, so the Great Law of Peace. This is the Iroquois Confederacy, influenced by a democratic idea, which is actually found in the Constitution. Yes, that's right. The U.S. Constitution was actually written with inspiration from the Great Law of Peace as well as like the Mayflower Compact and such. And we'll go into that later on when we get to that point. Okay, so actually we already did. Yes, we already did. So if you want to go back, you can actually learn about where the Constitution came from. Again, we just talked about that last month, the birth of the nation. Let's talk about the spirituality, because there was a lot of ethics in the Native Americans and the indigenous people. They had a lot of ethics that were built on their spirituality. For indigenous cultures, the land was not something they owned. It wasn't to be owned, which is why when the Europeans came in, they did not say, we own this land. No. They occupy it. They consider it their territory to be able to travel in and out. But it was sacred, and it was to be shared and respected. The land was to be shared and respected. Many cultures believed in a great spirit, which connected nature and a higher being. They practiced ceremonies that honored the earth, water, skies. So these are very sophisticated people in their own spheres, in their own areas. And the reason why I say sophisticated for what they were, because their sophistication, their technology was all based on what? Again, we've been talking about this so often, every single time I talk about it, survival. They were all about survival. So this deep relationship with the land would later clash with the Europeans, who had the idea of private ownership and territory expansion. Now, again, when I say territory expansion, remember the Native Americans, the Indigenous, they did actually believe in territorial expansion. That's why they were fighting with the other Native tribes. But they believed in it differently, not that they owned the land, they just wanted to be able to thrive in the land. They wanted to be able to expand in the land. So much like the Europeans came over, they wanted to own the land, but they also wanted just to expand in this. So there's things that you can learn from both sides. But all of this was to change as the European settlers arrived and grew. So let's go into this. Let's talk about the land loss that started happening with the indigenous people. So about the 1600s, that and onward, the indigenous communities faced relentless, I mean, it was over and over and over again, land loss. They lost war after war after war. As the colonies came in, well, of course, the Native Americans weren't able to live in that area anymore. Well, actually, they did. They still worked together. They still lived together. They semi-respected each other. But the Native Americans, I'll give you one that's a great proof of this, is the Cherokee. The Cherokee were in Georgia and South Carolina and parts of Florida. They still lived there when the colonies were there. It was later on, near the time of Andrew Jackson, 1812, that they were finally displaced during the Trail of Tears. Wait a second. That's not what I'm talking in school. No, it's not. There were actually tribes in the colonies that lived fairly peacefully with certain ones. Now, there was a lot of fighting between them and disagreements, but that's to be understood by neighbors. Again, the tribes, when they were living next to each other, there was a lot of argument, disagreement, and taking of land as well. So, nothing really 100% changed, except that the Europeans were powerful. The indigenous, they were powerful in their own spheres, but they did not have things like gunpowder, cannons, and guns, and sometimes even horses, and a few other things. Armor. The Native Americans, they were powerful for who they were. Okay, So let's talk about some of the early encounters. Okay, at first, the relationships between them, the indigenous and the European settlers, were complex. They were peaceful and some hostile. Let's see, up in New York, there was a African European that came over, can't remember his name, but he settled in New York area, I think on the island of Manhattan, and created a trading network between Europeans and the indigenous at the time. They actually bought the land of Manhattan. Yes, it was for probably pennies on the dollar of what they should have paid at that time, but it was actually purchased. A lot of land in the U.S. was actually purchased from the indigenous people. Now, when the Europeans came, I already mentioned this, they wanted to trade. They brought new goods, the Europeans, they brought new goods, iron, tools, guns, beads. I told you, beads. And I also mentioned this, they also brought disease like smallpox, which basically devastated the indigenous people. So, by early 1600s, English colonies such as like Jamestown and Plymouth, so Jamestown in Virginia, Plymouth up in Massachusetts, began to create permanent settlements. And yes, not on indigenous land, because they did not say they owned it, but indigenous land that they occupied at the time, or land that they occupied, and they moved out. Now they moved out trying to keep the peace between them, which actually did keep the peace for a while. But there was rise in wars. And again, we've already talked about this. French and Indian War we talked about in that unit. American Revolution we talked about in that unit. And also the expansion westward. We're going to be talking about it next month. I'm just going to go over a few. There's the Picot War, 1636 to about 1638. One of the first major wars between the English settlers and the Native Americans. Look it up. Okay. But the Pequot people were basically devastated, nearly wiped out. Then you had King Philip's War, the Wampanoag leader. His name was Metacom, or also known as King Philip, led an uprising against the English expansion. The war ended in the destruction of the indigenous people, and they had to move out of the way, move west. There were many survivors, and some of them were sold into slavery, some of them just left. There was the Covenant Chain, 1660 to about 1700s. It was a series of treaties between the British and the Iroquois. Remember, the colonists were not Americans, per se. They were British. Okay, so the Iroquois tried to use diplomacy to protect their lands, but the British continued to expand west. So the covenant was constantly being broken. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about today is the walking purchase. Walking purchase, what is this? It's a land swindle where the Pennsylvania officials tricked the Lenape people into losing large areas of their territory. But remember, it was not during the time of William Penn. William Penn actually bought a lot of the land, but it was the expansion of that when the leaders tricked somewhat the Lenape people. Now, there's a lot of conflict when it comes to this actual story. I'm not going to go over it. I'm going to let you to if you want to. Okay, so the impact of British colonists or colonization on the American nations, the indigenous nations. These people were pushed to go further west. As the British settled and moved west, the indigenous moved west, further west. They lost their hunting grounds, they lost their farming land, and were forced to just basically try to find ways of keeping their independence from Europeans, but also being able to trade with them. Some were enslaved. Now, this was only for a time because at one point there's actually laws in the colonies that said you can't enslave the Native Americans, and so they were released. But that's when the Africans came over, and that's when slavery of Africans was accepted. And when it was accepted, then all of a sudden we don't need the indigenous. Well, funny enough, the indigenous need the Africans to farm their land, and so they bought slaves as well. Okay, Now, the increasing loss of land led to new resistance movements. And we would talk about it right now, except I'm already at my time. But we're going to be talking about it in the expansion westward. So hold on till next month. You're going to get a lot more from there. This is like 2 weeks away. So please be patient with that. We're going to go into a lot of it. By the 1700s, British colonies expanded, basically devastated the eastern or southeastern and southeastern and northeastern tribes. And they had to move west. There was a lot of treaties and betrayals and removal. So, but we will be talking about more of that when we get into, this is when the American Revolution starts. Now, what happens when the American Revolution starts? The Native Americans the indigenous, or natives at the time, start siding with either the British or the colonists. They do that because they're trying to save their land. And they do that because they want to be with the biggest, quote-unquote, bully, the bigger group. Because if they were with the successful group, they're going to be able to win and have this friendship after the war is done. So the American Revolution was a big deciding point for a lot of the indigenous and a lot of the colonists. Okay, so before European contact, let's go over just a recap. Before European contact, indigenous cultures thrived in a sophisticated economy, government, trade networks. But then when the Europeans came, they had a lot of land loss, forced displacement, and it reshaped the Americas. The British colonies disrupted the indigenous life. But remember, it wasn't just the indigenous life and the British that created this disruption. It was how they lived before. Because there was a lot of fighting in the tribes, they were constantly being displaced or losing land to the other tribes. Another thing, the indigenous nations resisted against the colonists, but they tried to do it through diplomacy if possible and warfare if needed. And worst case, if they had to, cultural adaptation. So that's why they could actually live among each other, some of the tribes. Now, this was a struggle that was between the 1600s and the 1700s, but it created the foundation for future conflicts that would come. Because, of course, if they had everything from the 13 colonies over west from there, now the United States is there. It means there's a lot of upheaving. And we're going to talk about that on Wednesday. So thanks so much for joining me. I got one more thing. Wait, don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. I've got an action question for you. What do you think is the most overlooked aspect of indigenous history before the European contact? I know what I would say. I want to hear your thoughts. Put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. Again, one more time, the question: what do you think is the most overlooked aspect of indigenous history before European contact? Love to hear what you have to say. Thank you so much for joining us on this Adventure Box Podcast day, and we will catch you next time. That is tomorrow when we're talking about, I think, Greece, and then Wednesday when we come back to the indigenous people, and then Thursday back to Greece. Thanks so much for joining us. We will catch you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.